Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to the second AusIMM webinar on technical writing. My name is Stephanie Somerville. I'm the Senior Coordinator of Professional Development here at the AusIMM, and I will be your organiser for today. For those of you who didn't attend the webinar last week, Louise explained the basics of technical writing, including being clear and consistent, as well as being grammatically correct and well structured in your writing. Today's webinar is being hosted by the New Professionals Network and presented by Louise Correccia. Louise is currently the Technical Writing Assistant at AMC Consultants, as well as the Director of Red English, her own company that offers business writing and language training. Louise is passionate about effective communication and is here to present on technical writing skills. Now, for your convenience, today's webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the AusIMM website in the coming weeks, as well as emailed to everyone who has registered. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation for Louise or myself, feel free to type them into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, and if we have time at the end, we will answer them. Also, at the end of our session today, there will be a short exit survey, and it will appear on your screen. If you have the time, we would greatly appreciate you completing this and providing us with your feedback. I'd now like to pass you over to Louise to present on advanced skills for technical writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and hello everyone. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for those who attended last week and are attending again this week, and welcome to those who are attending for the first time this week. I will be covering advanced technical writing today and covering what I hope will be several points that will be helpful to all of you, regardless of your exact area of expertise and speciality. So as you can see, these are the areas, those 12 areas that we will be covering today. We will have a brief recap of last week's webinar, and then we'll talk about some other more advanced concepts, things that we should be aware of in our technical writing. That will include some information about peer review at the end too. So let's get started. First of all, for those who attended last week, we talked about an introduction to technical writing. We talked about the fact that technical writing is factual writing. So good technical writing is clear, consistent, concise, grammatically correct and well structured. It should not be vague, ambiguous or wordy. We're always considering the reader and making sure that the information is clear for them and doesn't inconvenience them or make reading difficult. So we should use terms and words consistently to avoid confusing or distracting the reader. A final tip that I have is that you can refresh your knowledge of grammar and punctuation if you think that these are areas of weakness for you. I greatly recommend doing that. It will make your writing so much easier. So first of all, formality. In technical writing, like in business writing, you should write in a formal style. So this means that you don't use colloquial English, like look into. This is an example of a phrasal verb. If you've learned English as a second language, you'll be very familiar with these sorts of verbs. We as English speakers tend to use them a lot, and it means using, say, two words like look into in a way that doesn't literally mean what those two words mean. So it's more figurative. By look into, we mean investigate. So try to use formal vocabulary like investigate instead of look into. Also try not to use words like around or about when you mean approximately. It's fine to use them in their literal senses, but not when you mean approximately. So some examples there. We looked into the issue, we should say we investigated the issue. And then some examples of a production rate of about 2 megatons per annum, or around 2 megatons per annum, should be approximately. It's colloquial to use about or around. It's not formal, technical or business writing. We should also not use contractions, which I think I mentioned last week as well. So those words with apostrophes, it's there and don't. We use the full forms it is, they are, do not. Familiarity is really important in technical writing. We should write in ways that are familiar to our intended audience. So this encompasses a lot. It means not using certain vocabulary if it's just going to distract or confuse the person reading what you've written, because the purpose of technical writing is to inform. So sometimes this takes practice for high-level experts. It can sometimes be difficult for them to step outside of their extensive knowledge and use words in a way that make their writing accessible to a wider audience. Also included in that is to write in the relevant variety of English, considering the audience. So again, we're not talking about which variety of English is correct or not correct. It's considering your audience and the eventual audience for your writing. So, for example, at AMC, we will make a conscious decision in a report in terms of what variety of English we're using. If it's an Australian, if it's going to be a mainly Australian audience and an Australian client, we will tend to write in Australian English. So that will be using things like ISE on the end of verbs instead of IZE. The reason is, again, not because something's correct or incorrect, it's what will cause the least distraction to the reader. And also, if our reports are going to a wider international audience, we will consciously choose international English. And we have a style guide that helps us with those decisions. We should also consider communicating with the non-expert audience in technical writing, especially in our reports. What I mean by that is not specialists in our particular field, being aware that perhaps a report might not just be going to other geologists, but also the lawyers of a certain company or the banks or someone else, or the mining engineer, someone else who might not be exactly familiar with everything that you're talking about. So just stepping back a little bit and being considerate of that. Of course, if a document is just going to your expert technical peers, you would probably be using a lot of vocabulary that you know that they understand. But it's just about considering that. So it's important to be concise when we write, but sometimes we might need to put in a few extra words to make sure that the concepts are clear to non-experts, especially at the beginning of a report or a paper when we might be outlining the main ideas and establishing our logic. So you should read over what you've written with a critical eye and be aware of what knowledge you might be assuming. I wrote down there the mum test, the last point there. That's a colleague of mine who uses this test, and I thought it was quite interesting. He said to me, look, my mum is a very well-educated woman, but she's not a mining engineer. So I do this test when I write a report. I read it over and think, could mum understand this? Could mum understand my logic? So that's an interesting story one of my colleagues shared with me, which I thought was a great way to be aware of communicating with a non-expert audience. Here's an example. So, and again, it depends. Some of this may be totally clear to you reading, but it's just being aware that perhaps it might not be for someone else who's reading this report. So this was from a technical paper that was all about infill drilling programs. So we really wanted to establish clearly at the beginning what the main concepts were before we went into the results so that anyone could follow the logic of the author. So as you can see, first it said the aim of an infill drilling program is to convert inferred mineral resources to higher resource categories to allow conversion to ore or mineral reserves. So that's fine, but if we read it a little bit more closely, we can see that there might be some underlying assumptions of knowledge there. So maybe that inferred mineral resources is a lower level resource category. And what are the higher resource categories? That's not made clear either. So it might be clear to an expert, but not to someone reading this report for the first time. So we changed it, and we ended up making more edits to this, but this was our first edit, which was the aim of an infill drilling program is to convert lower confidence inferred mineral resources to the higher confidence resource categories of indicated and measured. So a non-expert can understand that logic. Then a resource must be either indicated or measured before it can be converted to an ore or mineral reserve. So that might be seen to be obvious for some, but to a non-expert it really helped them be able to understand the logic behind the paper. So there are some techniques that we can use to control the vocabulary and style in multi-author documents, because often what happens when a lot of people are contributing to a report, for example, is that there are a lot of inconsistencies with the words being used and the styles, which can appear messy and take a lot of time to fix up at the last minute. So some of the techniques that we can use maybe as managers or project managers to control this include creating an industry or subject-specific thesaurus. So we have an industry-specific thesaurus in our style guide at AMC. You could also create a project-specific thesaurus in an initial project meeting. And by that I just mean a piece of paper with all the main words that you think you're going to use a lot in a report, and just making sure that you're all on the same page in terms of the spelling. So is it a rockfall, one word, or rockfall, two words? Just so that you can have consistency in your documents. You could also use in-house style guides, which I highly recommend, or authoritative style manuals. So if you don't have an in-house style guide, you might decide to use the Australian Government Style Manual if writing for an Australian audience. Just one example. And you could also have as a backup a default reference dictionary. So again at AMC, when something is not in our style guide, we will refer to the Oxford Dictionary, the online Oxford Dictionary, and we'll choose generally International English. So that's what we, and if a term is not in there, we'll note it down so that we can talk to the other project members about it and decide. Or we use me to make it consistent. We should also try to use templates with styles, and by that I mean preset styles, for example in Microsoft Word, and have these styles set up properly by someone who understands how to do that. And if you need a new style, for example for a heading, you should add it. Again, someone maybe in the admin team or someone might know how to do that. This will help avoid inconsistency later with inconsistent fonts or font sizing. So now we're going to go into a bit more detail about a couple of things we didn't cover last week, and that is sentences and paragraphs. So one common style problem is the use of overly long sentences, which are hard work for the reader. You should try to keep sentences to one or two main ideas with a maximum of 4. Some people are taught about certain word lengths in sentences, but that's not really the most important consideration. The most important consideration is that people can follow the ideas in a sentence. In fact, sometimes even shorter sentences with lots of ideas are harder to understand than a longer sentence with a few ideas. So it's about ideas. Look out for words like and, with, however, and which, perhaps also but. Those are often places where you can break up a sentence into 2 smaller sentences. I'm going to show you 3 examples now. So the first one is just splitting a long sentence. You can see that long sentence there about the mining costs. And you can see that I've highlighted with and which. It was at those 2 points that I realised we could start a new sentence. So we now have 3 sentences. A base mining cost of US $1.95 per tonne is used, an incremental cost of this much is applied for each vertical metre, and then this will ultimately increase the overall average mining cost. That just makes it a little bit easier to read for people. There was another change there, but that was just to do with something else. Okay, the second example is splitting a long sentence that could be misread. This is actually called a run-on sentence in editing. So Review any access and terrain conditions that could affect the logistics of exploration and development distances to existing or proposed transport routes should also be reported. And that takes a lot of breath. It's too long. And you can see that actually you might have had to read it twice like I did. You might have misread it the first time as terrain conditions that could affect the logistics of exploration and development distances, so affecting those two things, when in fact the development distances was the beginning of a new idea. So that was an example of where we could clearly just start a new sentence. So I could put a full stop and start with development distances, should also be reported. But I just made an extra edit, which was to also change the verb. So my after version is review any access and terrain conditions that could affect the logistics of exploration. Also report any development distances to existing or proposed transport routes. This is an example of splitting a long sentence with too many ideas. So as you can see, that first paragraph kind of has too many ideas for anyone to be able to follow, expert or not. So the rate of seepage of water through the seabed, so on. I rewrote it and changed it into 3 sentences, and we could even possibly split it further. Nevertheless, I think that it's easier to follow when it's split into 3 sentences. I won't read all of that out. I'll just leave that for you guys to read perhaps later. Think about it. And we'll move on. Paragraphs. So a paragraph is a unit of thought. It expresses one main idea. So all sentences in the paragraph are related to that idea. Again, like the word limits, there's no correct number of sentences per paragraph. It's about logical connection. So making sure that all the sentences within a paragraph connect to that main idea. Otherwise, it can be very difficult to read. So keep paragraphs to one main topic. It's a good idea, and again, you probably remember learning this in school, to start each paragraph with a topic sentence. And you might have learnt that you can put a topic sentence somewhere else in the paragraph as well, but in technical writing it's good to just keep it at the top of a paragraph so that when people are skimming through a report for the information that they need, they can easily just read the first sentence of each paragraph and then determine if they need to read that whole paragraph. So that's how it helps. And it just means a sentence which states exactly what that paragraph is going to be about. It also helps you as a writer stay on track. You should also use linking words or phrases like as a result, in contrast, similarly, however, to connect sentences, and this helps us have cohesive sentences that people read and they say, that makes sense, now I'm going to move to the next idea. So when the sentences within a paragraph connect and the paragraphs connect over a whole document, it makes your writing really easy to read and probably more effective. So here's an example of doxycycline at 250 milligrams killed 90% of the bacteria. Penicillin at the same dosage killed 60%. Penicillin at 500 milligrams killed all the bacteria. We recommend. Often I see these sorts of sentences in technical writing, and they're reporting information which is great, but it does make it a little bit difficult for the reader because they're just reading fact after fact after fact without being helped to make the connections between those ideas. So as you see after, I've put in some contrasting phrases or some connecting phrases. So both doxycycline and penicillin killed the bacteria, but at different rates. Actually, that's a topic sentence that I also inserted there just to make sure that people could follow what that paragraph's about. Doxycycline at 250 milligrams killed 90% of the bacteria. In contrast, penicillin at the same dosage killed 60%. However, penicillin at 500 milligrams killed all the bacteria. Therefore, we recommend. So that sort of writing, that sort of style is much more effective because it really helps the reader. I think you'd agree. Some other things that we could consider in terms of design and usability of our technical documents are that other than language, we should look at designing our document for maximum comprehension. So for example, I'm not sure if you know there's a difference between the serif or sans serif font. So as you can see there, the serifs are those little lines. So you see the different fonts there, the little lines on the ends of the letters. And then there's ones without those, and that's a sans serif, which means without serif. So there have been comprehensibility tests done on the choice of font, and those tests say that serif generally leads to higher comprehension rates for printed material, and sans serif fonts generally leads to higher comprehension rates for on-screen material. So that's something really interesting. Weldon was the name of that particular person who did those tests, and there was quite a difference. He did a comprehension test in terms of how much people understood of something when it was in the different fonts, and there were distinct differences. So that's something to consider. So also information should of course be designed so that it's easy to find, understand and apply. This includes section headings, table of contents, cross-references, and organising our information into topics and paragraphs that are cohesive so we can follow and find our information easily. We should be consistent with colour choices, and we should consider colour-challenged readers. So be careful with our colours, maybe red and green in particular, and we could employ other elements such as patterns to differentiate concepts within a graph. For example, not just using slight differences between colours that someone might not be able to recognise. When we do make a cross-reference in a report, it's really helpful for the reader if we're specific about that. So we don't just say as noted above or as noted earlier, but we're specific in case they want to go back and read that bit again. So as noted in readability issues on page 63. Okay, so we're going to do a poll now, just to see what you guys think of a question that I'm going to propose to you. So the question is, what is the best way to write the following instruction? So you should see two options there. So I'll just give you some time to read over that and think about it. Okay, so now you've all voted, and I can see that you all, well, the majority of you have chosen the second option, which is if you want to delete the records now, press OK, rather than press OK if you want to delete the records now. So not sure if you know why, but I'm going to tell you in procedure writing why that is the case. Okay, so thanks for that. The reason is actually at my third point there, which is place a condition before a conditional action. So as you chose correctly there, we should say if you want to delete the records now, press OK, rather than press OK if you want to delete the records now. That's just one example of how we can write more effective procedures. And the reason for that is that if that first section, the if clause, if it's not relevant to a reader, they don't have to read the rest of the instruction. Okay, so they don't have to get to the end and say, oh, that's not relevant to me. They can read at the beginning whether they need to read the rest of the instruction. Of course, that would be even more relevant if that instruction at the end was much longer. You wouldn't want to have to read through all of that before you realised it wasn't applicable. So this is one of the things that we try to do in effective procedure writing. Another one is that there is no set rule, again, like the words per sentence or sentences per paragraph. There really isn't a set rule about how many steps you should have in a procedure. It should be as short as possible and as long as necessary. Some people go by this 7 plus or minus 2 rule by George Miller in order to write procedures, and that is that the human brain is only capable of storing between 5 and 9 pieces of information. Now that's about memory, so that's why we have phone numbers, with 8 numbers, but it's not about steps that we can follow in a written document. So yeah, don't worry about that rule. Just write as many as you need to make it clear to people. And you should also be crystal clear in your procedure writing. And again, this takes practice. So instead of carry out pre-checks on the pump engine, what does that mean? Start the pump engine and check that water flows through it. So you need to be clear. Other things you could do are give instructions, not advice. So instead of the cutting oil reservoir should be changed every 4 hours, check the cutting oil reservoir every 4 hours. So you're giving a direct instruction with an imperative verb for those who know their grammar terms. You should also try to ensure the least effort, it's called the effort scale or something like that, the least effort to the reader by ensuring that the majority of readers do not need to read material intended for the minority. So an example, could you imagine that in most cases A is applicable and B is rarely the case? So we shouldn't write, if B is step 6, if B is the case, do this and do that. And then 7, if A is the case, do this and do that. We should put A first if A is what the majority of readers are going to follow, so that they don't have to read B that's irrelevant for them. So if A is the case, do this, and then if B is the case, do that. So that's a nice little principle that you should keep in mind when you're writing procedures, thinking about the majority of users and the information that's most important to them. Here's an example of a typical documentation development process. So as we see, we gather together the requirements and specifications at the beginning, come up with a documentation plan, that might be in an initial project meeting, and then we look at drafting and redrafting, testing the usability. So can people find things easily? Are the headings logical? Is the information easy to find and expected? Then we look at peer review and technical review. Sometimes these two can get put together, peer review and technical review. And then we prepare for publication and check. And then we should actually print it out and then review the proof with a proofreader. Okay, so that's where the proofreader should come in. So there should be a lot of planning and testing and review before we get to that stage of printing it out and reviewing the final proof. So that's a process that you could use. Now, on to peer review. It's usually done by a member of the writing team, so the writing team for that particular project or report. It's usually the technical review that is done by a technical expert in the field. Now, I know that we often put that together, but it is recommended that if someone is not really knowledgeable of the concepts surrounding effective technical writing, that you might get a contractor in to peer review from that perspective of the writing. Because not always, but sometimes technical experts can have difficulty stepping back from their advanced knowledge to read a document subjectively for its language and logic. So I'll move on to the next step, or to the next slide, sorry. So a peer reviewer will consider issues like, does the text match the process? Do the visuals match? Does the document follow the style guide? So at AMC, I'm the one who looks at whether the document is following the style guide, for example, and applying terms consistently, and whether it follows fundamental principles of good technical writing, so it's clear and consistent. It doesn't exhibit readability or usability flaws, so with the colours or with really long sentences that are not connected. That there aren't distracting flaws of grammar, style, punctuation and spelling. So we talked a little bit about those areas last week. And in technical writing, it's not about, being correct for the sake of being correct and following an English grammar rule because a teacher said so. It's because those errors could distract the reader and give a negative impression of you or your company. So that's a possibility. And looking at problems of structure or logic and any other points that are relevant to do with the writing. So here's a little table that you can use to produce professional documentation. So you can look at areas like structure, design, technique, language, and process. So I hope that I've touched on most of those areas throughout these two webinars. With structure, you can create templates, follow standards, and decide on special structures. When you design, you think of designing graphic art components and choosing graphic format, which I didn't really go into so much into the technical illustration, but that's one area that you should consider. Also, making sure that all the labels on your diagrams are there. Sometimes I find they're not, and then it's difficult to go and change them. So the technique of how you put together that document with one-click styling. So that's talking about using those styles that I talked about before, so for headings and paragraphs, so that you don't have to manually format each time. And when people manually format, and there are a lot of authors, it can create a lot of inconsistency. So that's why sometimes a technical writer will come in and lock those styles and not allow manual overrides. And checking all of the things, I forgot to mention grammar checker and possibly spelling checker disabled. That might be, you know, something that people might not be comfortable with yet, but it's something that I would do personally because unfortunately I'm aware of many of the weaknesses of the Microsoft Word in particular, grammar checker. It often tells people things that are incorrect that are not actually incorrect or vice versa. So it's not a human being and it doesn't understand the difference between words that could be spelt different ways, for example, and that a different meaning has been conveyed. So I tend just not to use it and use my own eyes and brain. Also with the language, again, choosing the language most familiar to the intended audience, both general language and technical language. Avoiding all of those problems of language that I've talked about, and mostly in last week's, about ambiguity, vagueness, verbosity, which means using lots of words, redundancy, extra words, and repeating ideas. So all of those language styles. And the process, which is, I gave you that little document, that little graphic that you could use for looking at the documentation development process. Okay, so I hope that you found those tips useful. I'm just going to have a look and see if anyone has asked any questions. The webinars? Here we go. We've got another question here. What is the difference between Australian and British English, and what is international English? Is it US English? So those are great questions. So now, again, it's funny because British English itself has some variation between the Cambridge and Oxford styles. So generally speaking, Australian English is more similar to British English. We share generally the spellings, like we would spell labour, L-A-B-O-U-R, spell verbs with I-S-E at the end, and some examples that I covered last week, like practice and practice, we would spell the noun, the thing, with I-C-E, and the verb with I-S-E, and those features are common across Australian and British English. International English is its own variant, so it's not US English. It borrows from different variants of English, but it is actually closest to Oxford English. Okay, this sounds really confusing, but if you go into the Oxford English Dictionary and you choose, it gives you options, and you can choose British and World English as one option. Funnily enough, many of those. Okay, I'll start again. So you can choose British and World English. That's what we choose. That's what we mean by international English. And what happens there, though, is the Oxford system actually has some things that people think are US English, like IZE. So, for example, if I'm reviewing a document and I change it to international English, some people think that I'm making it American English, but I'm not. I'm making it international English according to the Oxford Dictionary. So it's quite funny. Some verbs have ISE, some have IZE. I just refer always to that Oxford Dictionary British and World English option. I hope that that kind of made it clear.
Well, we'll end it there, and I'd like to thank Louise and thank everyone for attending the webinar today. We hope you found it valuable. I know that there are a few things there that I definitely will be taking away. A link to today's recorded webinar will be sent to you in the following weeks in an email. And just a reminder, don't forget to complete the exit survey, which will appear on your screen as you exit from the webinar. Thank you once again for attending today, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon.